Oh, testing. Does that work?
Yeah.
Just gotta hold it close.
Hi, good morning, everyone. How are you today?
Good.
Ready to enjoy the panel discussion?
Yeah.
My name is Mónica Guerrero, and I'm the program coordinator of Centro Sol, the Center for Latinos at Johns Hopkins. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you all for coming despite the issues with the transportation. So I would like to introduce the morning session, community responses to migrant integration and reintegration. Our moderator, thank you very much, is Ms. Annie Nelson. She's the head of communication and public affairs of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you, Hines.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Thank you for being here today and managing to make it in despite the metro. Just to give you a little background on myself, I'm the head of communications and public affairs for the ICRC here in Washington. I've been with the ICRC for about 9 years now, and I had the privilege actually to go down to the Mexican border with Guatemala last year with the Mexican Red Cross to take a look at some of the issues at the reception centers, the deportation centers there, or the centers where people were being held before being deported, and really got a sense for the humanitarian consequences of this phenomenon and the violence that is driving people to migrate. So it's a real privilege to be here today and to moderate this panel and to be with these wonderful panelists. So we're starting, we're kind of going in order here as the panelists are seated, starting with Annie. We're going to save questions. What we'd like to do, each panelist will have 15 minutes. And if there's a point of clarification that somebody wants, kind of immediately addressed, we can maybe ask that after each presentation, but we'll save the majority of the questions for the end. So I hope you don't mind, and please write them down so that we can have an interesting Q&A at the end. So let me start by introducing Annie Wilson, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And in that role, she ensures organizational alignment, integration, and impact. And she's coordinated the development of their strategic plans and led a shift from short-term service delivery to an emphasis on supporting a culture of welcome in communities. And that's something we're going to specifically address this morning. Then we have, sorry, I'm actually using the bios from the from the book, so please forgive me, but we have Stacia Hines, who's a child and family therapist, and she's with the Linkages to Learning program. So we'll be hearing from her specifically about how education plays a very important role in the integration process. Then we have Emily Kephart, who's the coordinator of Guatemala Child Return and Integration Program for the Kids in Need of Defense. So she's going to be talking really specifically about what she's experienced in Guatemala. And then I'm very honored to have a colleague from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement family here. Mauricio Paredes is the regional vice president for the Honduran Red Cross. And like many people, I think, in this family of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, he started as a volunteer in 1997 and has done a lot of disaster response. So it's a pleasure to have all of you here. What I'd like to do, maybe just to clarify a little bit, and I'm going to do this because it's on my phone, is look at just the specific definitions of what we mean when we're talking about integration and reintegration. So these are the terms as defined by the International Organization for Migration. So integration, while it can be understood differently depending on the country and the context, it is generally defined as the process of mutual adaptation between host society and migrant. It implies a sense of obligation and respect for a core set of values that bind migrants and their host communities to a common purpose. Integration is essential for all stakeholders not only as a way of providing economic and cultural benefits, but also for ensuring the security and stability of societies as a whole. One of the main challenges of creating an effective integration policy is to make sure that it intersects with other major policy areas, including the protection of migrants' human rights and equal opportunities, employment and labor market issues, regional development, national security, social cohesion, public health, education, and naturalization and citizenship issues. There's a lot to unpack in there that we'll be addressing this morning. And then reintegration, as defined by the IOM, is a fundamental, though challenging aspect in return migration. Preserving migrants' rights, ensuring their protection and well-being, and contributing to local development while enhancing the reintegration perspectives of the individual are vital. Enabling migrants to reestablish themselves in the society of their country of origin and empowering them to participate in social, cultural, economic, and political life again should be the aim of reintegration assistance in order for the return to be successful. While there is a growing understanding among stakeholders that the reintegration process needs to be supported in order to be successful, the means of doing so differ widely. So those are the definitions of integration and reintegration as defined by the IOM. And we had a bit of a conference call a couple weeks ago just to talk about what the panelists wanted to focus on, and something emerged, I think, across during those discussions, and that really was a notion of protection, the importance of protection in both the integration and reintegration process. So we'll be talking about that, and I think we'll actually start off, Annie, looking at economic security and social inclusion. Means that a person has a broader social world and is able really to engage in society as a full member of the community. What needs to happen, and how do you create the conditions for establishing a culture of welcome, as you describe it? Actually, we need to make sure you've got this so that the webcast can hear you.
So let me just get clear what the format is. Are we doing this as a Q&A through the panel presentations?
I was going to introduce kind of just the notion with you. It's the culture of welcome, but you now have 15 minutes. This was your kind of 15 minute slot to talk. So, but we can do, I'll jump in with questions if yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I was listening to the two definitions that you provided and thinking about a new colleague of mine in my organization who asked recently, can you just provide a really short definition of integration, so that everybody's on the same page and it's something that we can remember. And all the definitions that I've found of integration are as lengthy as the ones that you just read for integration and reintegration. But the aspect of integration that I wanted to focus on this morning was the aspect of integration being a dynamic and two-way process, the mutual process that you referenced earlier. And I will touch on that. The White House Task Force on New Americans has been working with the whole concept of integration and has identified these three sort of core aspects of it. One is economic opportunity, two is linguistic integration, and the third is civic integration. And I want to touch on each of those. But also touch on two other aspects of integration that are equally critical. So let me start with one of those two other aspects. And this is what I would call the precondition to make any kind of integration even possible. And that is the precondition that there be in place legal protections and some form of legal status. It is immensely difficult for somebody to become a part of a community, of a nation, of of a country if they're left out by virtue of their legal status, or if they have no protection against the possibility of return. And that's one of the situations that we're now finding a number of the Central Americans who've migrated to the United States facing. So that's kind of almost the super aspect of integration. Then to turn to the three aspects that have been sort of that are sort of the common denominator for a number of people working with immigrants and refugees across the United States: the economic, linguistic, and civic. So economic integration is the ability of somebody to feel economically secure, typically in the United States, which has a very open labor market. That means through participation in the workforce. But it's not only through participation in the workforce. There are people who are unable to participate in the workforce. But you cannot be integrated into society if you're left out economically. Linguistic integration is absolutely essential. It's one of the most critical markers of integration is that somebody is able to communicate with the community around them. And typically, that would mean that migrants acquire the language of the country to which they have migrated. I think in my organization's view, we would also say that if somebody has a social world or a community where they can communicate effectively, that is also a form of integration. And then third is this aspect of civic integration. My organization, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, we've been around for 75 years or more. We do refugee resettlement. We resettle 11, 12,000 refugees all across the country in 45 communities every year, not every year since the beginning of time, but in recent years. We do a lot of work with Central American migrants, much of it with children, some of it with the adults. So we have a lot of experience in this, and we did a series of community conversations across the country where we engaged about 1,000 people in talking about what is it that creates a culture of welcome. And what we heard again and again from migrants and refugees themselves is that the moment when they feel really welcome is the moment when they know that what they can give to the community is valued, when they feel that they're contributing. So it's less about receiving and it's more about being in the position of being able to contribute or give back that sort of marks that dividing line between, I was a stranger in this community and now I belong to this community. There's a sort of an overlap between that question of civic participation and this final dimension that also emerged for our organization as we engaged in this whole process of community conversations. And that's the social or the psychosocial aspect, which is not quite the same as civic participation. Some of the critical aspects of social integration are family bonds and ties. When people are separated from their family and have little prospect of reunification, it preys on people's minds. We heard this again and again. It's hard for me, to focus here because I'm so worried about my family in my home country, or I miss my children so much, or whatever it is that whatever the individual circumstances are. So it's not only a matter of sort of acute emotional pain to be separated from family, but family presence is also really important for successful integration. People need that foundation, that platform, that security in order to engage the rest of the world. You need those close family relationships. It's what gives you the sort of confidence and the emotional strength to engage. Mental health is also hugely important, and many migrants have gone through unspeakable experiences in their lives, many migrants and refugees. And without addressing the mental health barriers that prevent people from fully engaging in economic activity, in learning activity, in their social relationships, it's integration isn't going to be possible. And then finally, there's this aspect of social networks. So in addition to those relationships that are very close into people, their family, their loved ones, it's also really important that people have these more distant relationships that cross social groups, that give people access to wider networks. If you think about, if any of you have ever been in the position of looking for a job, you may have done some networking. And generally speaking, if you think about, how did you find out about a position that was open, or how did you go about pursuing that work? It has a lot to do with knowing people outside of your probably family, unless you're really fortunate in who your family is. You've had to develop those kinds of broader and more diverse networks. So in order to bring about all of those kinds of things, I'd like to make a couple of points about what's required for successful integration. Full and successful integration is the result of the interplay between the civic, economic, and linguistic aspects of the process, where the different aspects work effectively together and are mutually reinforcing. Beyond these core pillars, as I said earlier, the process of integration is also profoundly affected by the breadth and quality of social connections, by access to healthcare, by access to justice, by the integrity and unity of the family, by meaningful opportunities for self-expression and personal development, and by many other factors that shape our complex social worlds. In years of experience working in communities across the United States, LIRS has found that integration is inhibited when individuals are marginalized in any one of these aspects, and advanced most effectively when service providers, community groups, public officials, and public and private institutions intentionally collaborate to advance a coordinated and holistic response to integration. It's crucially important that the actors engaged in the integration process are aware of the manner in which the different aspects interact, and that coordination between helping organizations and institutions reflect the range of factors contributing to integration. I want to end with a sort of, I guess that one other point I want to make is that there's no single path to integration, neither for individuals nor for communities. Every individual is different. Somebody's going to have different skills. Somebody is going to have different opportunities. And communities too are different. It's really a very, to go into a meatpacking town in Iowa is really different from going into a community in New York City. So on both sides, there's no one size fits all. So I can't tell you, here's the magic bullet for integration. It's really tailored for individuals and for communities. The last point that I'd like to make has to do with the overarching topic of this day, which is resilience. We've talked a lot about resilience. We have talked and will talk a lot about the resilience of individual migrants, but I also want to make a point about the resilience of communities. A community that engages in social learning which is learning as a community to be adaptable, to learn what kinds of changes are happening in the environment and to think about the best way forward. That kind of community, which is a dynamic and welcoming community that actually steps forward into the change that's coming, is going to be a community that has the resilience that's going to be needed for the challenges that our future is posing for us. And so successfully tackling the question of integration is actually one of the really critical things for communities to be able to do in our world today. And the welcoming communities are also successful communities.
Thank you very much. I think it sounds like the reason that definition of integration is so long is because of all these complex issues that need to be dealt with. And I think your point about there's no single path. Every community, every individual is different and is going to require different things is a very important one. The kind of takeaways that I took from what you were saying are that the keys to inclusion are workforce, linguistic language adaptation, and that sense of value that gives people a sense of belonging. The social integration depends on family presence and providing that foundation. The mental health barriers that need to be addressed in the trauma that so many people have faced, and then the social networks that need to be there in order to give people a wider sense of belonging to something as well.
And I just want to say again that when in a country that has 11 million people living without immigration status, that is a serious issue, not just for those 11 million people, but for the broader American community that is where you do not have people fully integrated into our society.
And maybe when we get to the Q&A section, we could tackle just a little bit what are the activities and actual policies that could be put in place in order to ensure that inclusion is a true part of integration. Stacia, now I think it would be interesting to look a little bit at the educational aspects. You're with Linkages to Learning. Could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of education as part of the inclusion and integration of children? It was interesting. I don't know if you all noticed in your packet, there was a quote that says, "Children don't migrate, they flee," and I thought that was a very just a very telling and true statement. And so, how does education provide some support in terms of inclusion and integration?
Yeah, the education system is really a great way to be able to integrate children and their families into society. All children need to go to school, and they learn first in the home and then in the school setting. So with that said, it's essential. In school, they learn to socialize with other children. They learn the rules and the norms, not only of their peers, but as society as a whole. So for children who aren't migrants, that can even be a very difficult time. So the school has this goal of using, the education system has a goal of not only socializing our children that were born here, but also children that are migrating. It's important to note there too that not only are the migrant children changing, but the other students are also changing, and that was, like you were speaking of, social learning. So the school's role, as I said, is socialization and acculturation, and being involved in the education system also is linking these families to other people in the community. The children are making friends, and it also helps with the logistics. When families come into the country, the children need to learn how to enroll in school. In Montgomery County, at least, there's an international student office where they go and make sure they have all their paperwork in order, make sure they have their immunizations, and a lot of that is done free of charge, which is a big barrier reduction for these families. And they'll usually have people in the International Student Office that can interpret for the parents and make sure they get off to the right start. Some of the barriers although the education system is a great place for inclusion and integration, huge barriers are still present. Language is oftentimes one of the biggest ones. There's difficulty understanding the school system. Our school system in this country is very different from other countries. The scheduling, when there's parent-teacher days off, when school starts, how to use the buses. There's also, with migrant children, some of them are coming to not only a society that they're not familiar with, some of them are being reunified with parents who they don't remember, or they're living with family members or maybe non-family members. And so they're just being plucked from their society and dropped into a new school, but also into a new family. And they have all that separation from their country, from their culture, from whoever they had been with before. And I'll talk a little bit more about those effects with mental health later on. And then there's all these policies that we have in effect. If the children coming don't have legal status, they don't have access to a lot of the necessary benefits in this country. Oftentimes they arrive not realizing how expensive healthcare is in this country, how expensive food is, and especially if they're coming on their own, it's a big change for families. And the trauma, as I had mentioned before, and you had mentioned, a lot of them have been through unspeakable things. They may or may not be able to verbalize it based on how old they are, how they experienced it. And then poverty. Just many of these children are coming, they may have debt from however they got here, if they've come and they've had to pay someone a debt to get here, the family has to pay that off. If they're older children, then they have the burden of feeling as though they need to work as well as attend the education system. Employment for parents, because when children come, it's not only the child who has a lot of things going on. You also have the parents, and based on their status, and now having a child in the home with child care, employment becomes a big difficulty. Transportation and understanding our transportation system. Can they get a bank account if they don't have a social security number? Just tons of economic and financial burdens for these families, especially when another child comes into the home. One thing we've seen a lot, especially at our school, is families have to move oftentimes when the new family members come in. They're already in difficult living situations with lots of people in the home, and you add another 1 or 2 kids into the home, and they have to move, so they might need to change schools again. There's a lot of uncertainty during those periods of change. And another barrier they face is discrimination. Unfortunately, that's a very common occurrance for them. Sometimes because of language, sometimes because of social status, sometimes because of where they've come from. And that discrimination creates another level of another barrier, which is fear. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the policies that kind of enhance that fear. Fear of deportation if they don't have a legal status. And if a child, even if you have a child who is a U.S. citizen or resident, and if their parent is not, that fear of knowing their parent could be thrown in jail or deported at any moment has huge implications for the child. So with all those barriers, the schools have some things in place. ESOL programs help children when they come in. Some schools have an ESOL counselor who's able to provide some mental health services to those children. There are some schools have ESOL PCCs, parent community coordinators, which are able to support families in navigating all these systems. There's a special education system if children need special education. That can be a difficult process to navigate. There has to be a lot of advocacy, so some families, especially families of migrants, have difficulty accessing those in a timely manner. There's school counselors, although a big barrier there is many of them don't speak the native language of the children. A program I'm actually not super familiar with, but I learned about just this past year is the METS program. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that. It's for interrupted schooling. We've had a few of our children move to one of these programs if they have in their home country missed a couple of years of schooling. So not only is the language a barrier, but they're just academically not up to par. So this program sort of accelerates them along so that they can reach the same level. So those are some things that are in place in a lot of schools. Title I schools or schools that have a large number of low-income families have some extra supports. They have their own parent community coordinator who supports parents and engaging parents. There's school breakfast for all students in a lot of Title I schools, so you don't even have to sign up for it, you just have to show up on time for school and you can get that. And then there's the reduced and free lunch program if they get all the paperwork filled out for that. So those are some things that, you know, to help reduce those barriers. In most schools that have large numbers of migrant children, that is not enough. And accessing those services, they show up and they're not really sure. They need somebody to sort of help support and guide them along. So that's kind of where the basis of the program that I'm with is Linkages to Learning. It's linking families to what they need so that the children can learn. Because we know mental health is a huge concern. Some kids are physically present in school, but because of various factors, they're not able to learn. So our program we're based in the school and we're a team of 3. We have a case manager, a therapist, and a school coordinator. The case management is really to help meet those basic needs of families. Our case managers work with the parents to make sure that employment needs and poverty and things that impact them, such as poverty, making sure they have access to legal representation, knowing that, you know, it might be a good idea to get legal representation when they have court dates, know that they should go, things like that. Also, healthcare, linking them to clinics. And there are many community resources in Montgomery County especially, but all over the place. There's nonprofits that are trying to help out, but the hardest thing they have is finding the people that need the help and the people that need the help finding them. So that's what our program works to make those links for families. And then my position is family and child therapist. So a lot of these children who are migrants do not have health insurance. And our program sees many students with Medicaid, but also we're able to see students who don't have health insurance. When transportation is a concern, we're able to pull the kids directly from the school. And a lot of, I'd say majority of the families that I've worked with coming in, it was, oh, mental health, no, therapist, I don't need that. My child's not crazy. There's just this very huge stigma against mental health. And we're a prevention and intervention program, so we're trying to catch them early so that the children and the parents can learn coping skills to get through all these huge stressors of not only the trip here, but also the changes and all the things they're going through in our society. And a role that all of us in our program have is advocacy. Sometimes the teachers say, this kid's not coming to school, the parents don't care. There's just this frustration sometimes and difficulty understanding children who come from a family of migrants. And so advocating for them and jumping in and seeing if we can help them address the barriers that they have. to completely integrating into the school system. Another program, we also have ESOL classes for parents, so that is, and if the parents aren't able to come to our ESOL classes, linking them to other classes in the community. We offer childcare during that time, because that's oftentimes a problem as well. Work schedules, things like that are very, very difficult, especially for families who don't have a lot of say in their work schedules. And I'm gonna try to wrap up a little bit real quick, but before I finish, I wanna just bring up a policy. I'm not sure if how many people heard in January about all of the there are a lot of immigration raids going on in different parts of the country, and in my school and throughout the county, the impact of that was huge. That week I had every student who actually showed up to school, because not all of my kids of migrant families showed up to school. They were worried and stressed, and here you have first graders, second graders coming in and saying, they're gonna take my mommy and my daddy away. My mommy didn't go to school, or didn't go to work today, because she's afraid that they're gonna take them, pick them up at work. So those things that are very adult in nature, you think to worry about, little children are very, very affected by that. Not only are the parents affected by it, and economically and emotionally, but the children as well. It really pulls into their ability to learn and their ability to integrate. And many of them are afraid to talk about it with their peers because of the discrimination and the stigma. So it's a lot of the barriers kind of play into a little bit of a cycle, and that fear that not only the parents have, but the children also feel as well.
Wow. There's a lot in there. Yeah, it seems, as in so many humanitarian situations, that it's the most innocent people who are the biggest victims in this. And it sounds like children certainly face a tremendous number of challenges. And just to recap, some of your points, I think that the point about school being key to their socialization, and it kind of touches a little bit on what Annie was saying about the inclusion and belonging to something, is so important, and then obviously does help the families link up with other families. And then, as you mentioned, the barriers in terms of language, understanding the system, living with people they don't know, the separation, trauma, potentially having debt, the burden maybe of needing to work as older kids, the endless economic and financial burdens that they face, as well as discrimination, and that's really important. I mean, that was all over the news, in January, the issue of the immigration raids and the fear that went around that. And then what schools can do really is, provide the language support, special education, advocacy, counselors, extra support in catching up, meals, and then of course the important work that your organization is doing. It sounds like you're making a real difference in terms of providing some of those things and making sure that people have access. Thank you very much. So now we're going to switch. We've kind of been looking at integration issues, and now we're going to switch to reintegration. And I was looking at the Migration Policy Institute's reports. They did a regional report looking at stopping the revolving door of reception and how reception and reintegration services can play a role in stopping the kind of revolving door of people migrating, being deported, and then remigrating. And one of the in the executive summary, they state that returning to worse conditions than they tried to escape in the first place, this rapidly growing population of deportees is in danger of entering a revolving door of migration, deportation, and re-migration. So now we're going to look a little bit at how those issues can be addressed. So, Emily, what lessons, you've been really focused on Guatemala. What lessons have you learned there and that could be applied elsewhere? And how do you, I think it sounds like you've been looking a lot at how communities in general suffer when the support and services that they need to help people reintegrate aren't there. And especially, what's also interesting, I think, is that some of the issues that Stacia touched upon in terms of debt and the financial burden and lack of language or lack of schooling and all of that is also an issue when you're reintegrating into your home country. So talk to us a little bit about perhaps starting with Guatemala and then and all of these different issues.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for being here. And I just want to say thank you both for sharing. And after hearing your presentations, I think my biggest takeaway is that really at the base, these populations have the same needs, whether they are trying to integrate in communities here or whether they're having to go back to their home countries and reintegrate there. We're really not so different. The context, on the other hand, can be very different, and therein I think lie some of the biggest challenges. So I just want to take a second to sort of do a little statement of the problem and what we're really talking about. Obviously, I think this is a pretty high context audience. You all know that there are still very high numbers of child migration from Central America. And to be clear, I'm going to talk about reintegration as it relates specifically to children. But this MPI report that Anne just referenced is really phenomenal, very comprehensive, and talks about children and adults. It's incredible, you should read it. So all that to say, continuing very high rates of child migration throughout Central America. We may have seen some of a dip at the of children arriving at the US border over the last year and a half. But to be sure, those numbers are not declining throughout the region. And that presents some of its own challenges. Children are migrating from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras at extremely high rates. And also children from Guatemala, generally the highest migration rates come from the Western Highlands, which is a highly indigenous area that has suffered several decades of genocide and marginalization through the Civil War and other systemic forces, and in a lot of ways continues to be marginalized, people in those communities. And so when we look at the reasons people migrate from those communities, certainly there are issues of extreme poverty and lack of economic or educational opportunity. Both of those things are indicative and stem from some of the systemic issues at play there. We're talking about some very isolated Mayan communities that speak several different Mayan indigenous languages. Programming schools and job opportunities and training facilities, health posts are very, very difficult to access. We're talking about sort of social fabric and support that's very thin on a systemic level. Communities themselves are very resilient. We see a lot of the resilience factors and a lot of the empowerment coming from community members and community-based organizations themselves. But we also need to take into consideration in some circles, one of the lesser considered factors for Guatemala is that Guatemala does not have the levels of gang and cartel violence that Honduras and El Salvador do, but there is some, but it has an exceptionally high rate of domestic violence, intrafamilial violence, and gender-based violence. Women and girls are at an extreme disadvantage in Guatemala. It has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world. And so we need to keep that in mind, but especially girls who are migrating from Guatemala, we are really talking about a question of violence. And it may not be that, oh, the gang member who I didn't sell drugs for is going to hunt me down when I come back, but a much slower, much more sort of discreet kind of violence that these people are facing when they go back. And not just girls. I mean, boys absolutely suffer sexual and gender-based violence as well. So things that we need to keep in mind when looking at that population. I'm gonna slow down for a second. So one of the first thing we really need to look at when talking about reintegration is what happens before they leave, what happens in the return, deportation, repatriation process. When you're looking at children leaving the US, you can be reasonably certain that they have had hopefully at least a legal screening, possibly legal representation in court. Hopefully they were not 3 years old and deemed appropriate representatives in their own case in court. And at the very least, if they're passing through our program, I facilitate the sort of pre-departure interviews for the reintegration programming, and that's sort of one last ditch effort, that if there's any issue, if there's any need for international protections, if there are super high risk factors, we certainly have the capacity to sort of raise the flag on that and reach out to legal service providers and say, hey, maybe we really need to reopen this case. Maybe this is not a child who can be repatriated and reintegrated safely, because that really is the first and most essential part of a successful reintegration, is that a child be returning to somewhere that is safe. We absolutely cannot be talking about reintegration and repatriation of children who are not returning to somewhere that can provide safety and security for them. If we're talking about children who need international protections, then what one of our opening speakers was talking about this morning, we need to be talking about how to enforce those laws of international protection. We've definitely seen an increase in interest from the US government and enforcement arms in looking at what does repatriation programming look like. So that's hopeful. And I think we are in some conversations with some other organizations to talk to the US government about what does this look like to do reintegration work with these populations if we're going to be doing increased deportations. Unfortunately, when you look at this phenomenon from Mexico, because we're looking at a much higher number of migrants who are being detained and deported from Mexico, we cannot be certain that protection screenings are happening. Children are being apprehended and turned around and deported in 24 to 72 hours is what we're seeing. And from Guatemala, we're talking about the reception center in the highlands of Guatemala receives approximately 3 busloads of 80 children each week. So 3 times a week, 80 children, 240 children every week, just from Mexico to Guatemala. That doesn't include the children who are being returned from northern Mexico by air. So a very high number. So we really need to look at what does protection for children being apprehended in Mexico, children who are seeking asylum or in need of international protection, potentially third country screening for refugee resettlement, a lot of policy issues on that end as far as child protection goes. And now I'll talk about reintegration. So really, like I said, the reintegration conversation begins pre-departure, and that allows us to have conversations with children to identify where they've come from, what they've traveled through, what their process was in the US, and how they're feeling and what they're anticipating will happen when they go back. It also allows, our program works with partner organizations on the ground in Guatemala, and that pre-departure screening allows us to make connections with our partner organizations, to contact families, to sort of help coordinate that actual initial moment of reception. Which can be very difficult, particularly in Guatemala. We have a conversation of geography. We're talking about, it's essentially the Montana of Guatemala. If you had to go from Montana to Washington, D.C., that's sort of the barrier you're looking at. It's not that big, but generally the idea. So families really need the support to even get to the capital city to receive their child, and timely communication from government officials and us to Guatemala is really an important key there. When you're looking at challenges, the challenges that you have to start looking at and what you're going to need to overcome when you're looking at reintegration of a child is, first of all, you're looking at this child is feeling a sense of failure. Likely they made the decision to migrate as a family unit, and they are now returning without having made either the educational gains or the economic gains or just even the safety, hopefully not the safety, but the safety, goal that they had in the U.S. They're looking at this massive debt that is we're looking at around $10,000 US that this child and their family have to try to repay. They have potentially mortgaged properties and houses, mortgaged collateral, given away as collateral for these loans. And so these are some of the big sort of psychological pressures that are happening with this child, in addition to all the very basic material and quality of life needs that Stacia and Amy talked about. So when we're looking at reintegration programming, I want to talk about a couple of the very essential components that we think that reintegration programming should have throughout the region. So this is what we've been doing in Guatemala, but I think the same kinds of efforts are being made. Casa Alianza is working in Honduras, and I'm sure that the Red Cross has done. The Red Cross throughout the region has really worked on this issue of initial reception, which is critical, and I think thanks to that we can move along and talk about reintegration. And there are some organizations really trying to work in El Salvador as well, but the components start with, you really need to have implementing partners that are community-based, organizations who are based in the communities where they will be serving their families. A lot of the efforts so to date have really focused on sort of the capital cities or even the bigger urban centers throughout the country, but we're talking about people who need to, come from diverse communities across countries. And the benefit of having community-based partners in the communities is that not only are they just geographically closer and more familiar with the actual services that are in place, but they have a cultural and a linguistic capacity and competence that larger organizations or organizations that are further away might not have. The process of goal setting really needs to be participatory, and it needs to take into account the idea of child as part of a family unit and as part of a community. Like I said before, this child likely did not make the decision to migrate on their own, and they likely don't exist in a world back in Guatemala where they can just have all their own hopes and dreams and sort of move along that path. You really have to work within what exists in their community as far as resources and what their family is able or willing to support them in, within reason and within the framework of best interests and child protection. Really, the programming should include things such as home visits for goal setting and evaluation of what's happening in the community, linkage to health systems and psychosocial supports. We're talking about communities where there is not a mental health system per se. There's not a child protection system. And so you're really working on sort of a patchwork collection of services for each child and each family, which is why it's important that these services be individualized and provided at the local level with connections to government agencies and the larger civil society. Job and skills training programs are also really important. Guatemala is in the semi-fortunate position that the job and skills training that does exist does take into account that a lot of these children have had interruptions in education or no education and are trying to pursue these things simultaneously. And so you do have several programs that are either on nights and weekends, or there's a program that's radio-based where you listen to your classes 2 hours an evening, and then on Saturdays go to a class to have instruction and tutoring by an actual human in person. So encouraging governments to take those that diverse spectrum of needs into consideration when developing programming, I think is also really, really important. And that sort of leads into the whole idea that our return and reintegration programming, our partners also really have this element of community-based trainings and citizen empowerment, really trying to involve citizens and encourage them to petition their governments, petition their local governments, their departmental governments for the kinds of services and attention that they need. Because, I mean, especially there's so much room for improvement in so many of these communities, and I think really hearing from their own citizens and empowering citizens to say, these are our needs, we really need to address these issues. I mean, I think that looking at the things from that angle really we look at reintegration programming also as prevention. We think that migration is right, but I think that also it is important for people to know what the risks are and what the realities are, both in transit and the US. And also we really need to look at creating a society that can support all of the variety of needs that families and children have, so that hopefully there is no more forced migration and forced displacement. Like I said in the very beginning, we have seen an increase from both the US government and governments in the region and an interest in reintegration programming, and that this really is an issue that with this quantity of people moving throughout the region, it is really a conversation that needs to be had on a much bigger scale. And so I'm glad to say that we're really looking at how that can be moved forward. Thank you so much.
I can't believe how much you guys are managing to get into 15 minutes. This is, we're looking at some really complex issues here. I love what you said at the beginning, which is that it appears that the needs and the issues are not so different, but the contexts certainly are. And I think that sums up. In the interest of making sure that we do have time for a Q&A, I'll move on to Mauricio, but thank you very much for that. So now, Mauricio, you're involved with the reception centers in Honduras. Can we first look at just, can you describe the reception center that you're involved with and how it's evolved over time?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the American Red Cross for the opportunity. And second of all is that English is my second language, so I please
We'll do
understand.
another one in Spanish sometime.
Well, basically, we started over 3.5 years ago with the willingness of the National Society of the Honduran Red Cross and the ICRC to look over the humanitarian needs of the people who have been deported from Mexico back to Honduras through the Guatemalan border. And this was an issue because they were just being transported into the Honduran border and just left there by themselves, no one to take care, no one to provide any receptions or anything. So due to this fact, we started in a process with the ICRC to find out a little bit more about the situation, and immediately became something that was needed to be addressed by us. So that's how we started a program that was providing basic humanitarian support at the border. We established an operations center there, so it was a small operation at the beginning in which we were providing 4 basic needs. They were hygiene kits, basic information, first aid, and reconnecting families by providing free phone calls. Especially to take in consideration that 99% of all these people were from other parts of Honduras, not from the local area. So providing basic information was basically one of the first things we needed to do to make sure they knew where they have been deported back and where they were and how to get back home was a big issue also. So ever since June of 2012, we started this program. We ran the program for over 3.5 years right there in the border, in the Honduran border. And one of the main things we also wanted to do while we were running this program is to make sure that these populations were visible to the government, to the local government. Because although we had taken the responsibility in a sort of way of providing these basic services, we didn't want to take the responsibility that the local government has to take on assisting their own population. So that was also something that we had attached to the program ever since we started. We needed to do the lobbying in order to make sure that they look this way and to address that situation. Then after, like I said, after 3.5 years of being working in the border, we finally got the interest of the government, of the Honduran government, in order to establish a task force. And it was led by the First Lady of Honduras and a whole different group of representatives of NGOs, but also from the government's different offices also were there. And that's how we got her to visit our operation sites in the border for the first time in over 3 years. And once she was there, she immediately reacted positive to what we were doing and to the needs that we needed to move forward to a bigger and more integrative reception center. So back in 2015 on September, they finally stepped forward. They finally decided to move forward by assigning a property that was confiscated by the government through a process that goes on in Honduras by confiscating properties for people who are into trafficking and stuff like that. So we were provided a big, huge property, which is about 50 miles away from the border, which also made it a lot interesting for us to start our work. And ever since September of last year, we were able to, in combination with the government, open this new big reception center. Now, um, the the reception center is up and running, but another interesting thing is that for the first time, our national society and as a Red Cross movement, we were able to establish a agreement between us and the government. We signed just recently an agreement that allow us to run the center as managing the center, but being sponsored financially by the government. And we have established that in the best interest of providing the best support and help to our citizens, that their center should run by our standards and not by the government standards. So trying to get the government to understand that they will pay for it, but they will allow us to run the center under our standards was a huge step for us. It took a lot of lobbying, it took a lot of going back and forth, and until we finally agree on this. And we have to mention that we had a lot of support by the ICRC. They have been probably one of the best allies that we've had over the last 3.5 years on this work. And we finally stepped into this now huge operation that we run, taking consideration also that just like they were saying, the contexts are extremely alike. We are receiving an estimate of 6 buses every single day, Monday through Friday, with a 36 to 40 people load of each bus. So we take in about 1,000 people a week in our reception center. So we run a big operation right now, and it makes it challenging, and it makes it a big effort because we are since we just started this new joint operation, we have to have our volunteers train the staff of the local government that are also part of this operation into our standards. So we do not only do the assistant part, but we're also into the training part right now. We hope for that in the future we can be in a better position to just concentrate a little bit more in other things. But right now we're making a strong effort on this, and we're getting through, to be honest. So like I was saying, this is the first experience on National Society being able to sign up an agreement such as this with a local government. And this has also have another challenges that has have been also open for us. And one of the things is that, and this is focusing in reintegration also, is that the government will provide several additional assistance that weren't provided at the beginning because of our limited budget. And one of these are transportation, providing transportation for our citizens to go back home, which is a big issue. Before, since they were being left at the border and no transportation was provided, then we were in that revolving door process. They were just turning around and trying to go back home, back to the route. So now, since we're a little bit farther away from the border, and we are also providing additional assistance like transportation, then this has declined the amount of people that try to go back just as they come into the country. But also we have been challenged now by the fact that the presence of the government also in the center has to do with the fact that their interest in having more information about this, not just the social economic background of the citizens that tries to leave the country, but also why the reasons of them to leave. So right now, the center runs a small survey sort of space in which they go, every single one of them has to step in as the reception process goes and fill out this survey in order to have some information. So our challenge right now is to see how we can link these the surveys that are being done by the government to the surveys that we might be interested in also having in order to find out a little bit more. And we have been, these were initially into the agreement that we signed with the government, but now we have retaken these steps to make sure that we are able to access to all these informations, not just for us, but also to other NGOs that are interested in providing additional assistance once these citizens go back home. So that's another part of our process. Also, something that is interesting is that the government has been working on new laws that will help reintegration process make it more easier. For example, they were just talking about education for kids. Before, once the kids stepped out of school and missed 2 weeks of school, they couldn't go back to school. They probably missed the entire year. Now there's the new law that allows the kids to come back to school if at any time. They have new support that will help them catch up on what is it that they were missing while they were gone. But the basics is that they have the opportunity to go back to school, which is very important. And also, they were talking about the economic situation once they come back home. Most of these people, you have to take in mind that they will sell everything they've got in order to be able to pay these $10,000 or whatever to try to get out. So if they get sent back home, they've got nothing else to come back to. So the government is providing at the reception centers special job, like sort of job offers that are there. Although they're not a long-time solution, they're just sometimes they're just part-time jobs and stuff like that. But it also makes it another interesting point of having additional things to have at the reception center for the reintegration of them. We also follow up a lot on special skills these our citizens might have, and that's also something that is introduced in the survey that they do on a daily basis. And there's also another part of the reintegration process that can in some way be seen at our reception center. They have to do with projects or programs that are run by the ICRC or the IFRC. Especially the IFRC has recently stepped forward with several things regarding small programs that will provide funding for amputees and stuff and people like that who might need a heads up to start back into the reintegration program. And also the IFRC and the ICRC are also involved in these processes. So these are also something else, additional things that we are also looking and doing there. Okay, so we're running out of time. And just to wrap it up, I would like to point out that we just recently started working as a network of national societies, so we can focus a little bit more on immigration issues. And as of right now, the group is being led by the American Red Cross and the Mexican Red Cross. But now we also have a strong presence and participation of the IFRC. We just recently did a meeting in Honduras at the Puerto Cortez city, which is about 20 miles away from the reception center, in which we were able to get all the national societies, our focal points on immigration, to come down and to see what we're doing and to be able to exchange our experiences and our good practices on what we're doing right now. And we're in the process of having our final report being presented by the IFRC. And from this point forward, we know that there's still a lot of things to be done. We are looking forward to strengthen the capabilities of our national societies to integrate this group and also to be able to share information between us regarding the assistance that we are providing to the migration issue. So there's still a lot of things to be done, but we are optimistic.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. On behalf of the ICRC, we are certainly very proud and privileged to be a part of the wonderful work that you're doing. I myself have been able to see what the Mexican and Guatemalan Red Crosses are doing on the ground, and it's just incredibly impressive, and it's great that this new network has started. in all of what you were saying, I think protection, again, going back to that theme we identified at the beginning, it really seems so central to addressing all of these issues, giving people the resources and the support that they need, and creating first the culture of welcome, ensuring that education is there, really looking at the needs of children specifically and addressing those. And then making governments, I think what you provided there is a really great example of how governments can play a positive role in that reintegration process. And what I love too about everything we heard here today is that, I think so often migration is seen through the prism of being nothing but problematic. And here in the US, obviously, it's really seen as a national security issue when it is such a fundamental humanitarian issue. And what I loved in everything that you said is that there are opportunities and that there are actual solutions. And so there's a real positive message coming across here. Who has questions? And I think I'll pass this off. It looks like we'll probably have a few. Do you want to be taking this around? So I'm going to get off the mic and we'll go around. So we've got one question here and one there.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Benny Uzal. I'm a former refugee from DR Congo and the Maryland State Refugee Delegate to the Refugee Congress. But I have a question for Annie. You give some definition on the definition of integration. You talk about economic, linguistic, and civic integration. But you forgot to talk about social integration. I'm working with LGBT refugees and asylum seekers. And that area, we don't see the involvement of refugee resettlement agencies, especially those with faith connotation, religious, Lutheran, or Catholic, or Episcopal. There is a coalition now of human rights organizations with a focus on LGBT organizations. They say that they should lobby the government not to give money to faith-based organizations to resettle LGBT. And I have noticed some failure, especially when we are working on a program to bridge LGBTI refugees and the broader American LGBT community, because we believe that LGBT refugees cannot integrate without being connected to the American LGBT community. We don't have resources and expertise. So when we talk to some of your people at LRS, especially at the your local affiliate like Lutheran Refugee Service in Houston or somewhere else, they are trying to tell us that they are very progressive in the integration of LGBT refugees, but the top is homophobic. And
sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask a question. So maybe
my question is that, how do you give us some confidence that we can trust the organization on that issue of LGBT?
Thank you.
Well, sorry, I was quiet for too long. First of all, thank you for the question. One of the statements that I made is that there is no one-size-fits-all program for integration for refugees or immigrants. And LGBT refugees are a good example of how not all refugees and immigrants are going to integrate in the same way. So what I would like to do is to assure you that at the very top of our organization, there is a commitment to the successful integration of LGBT refugees, that we have provided guidance to our network that addresses many of the very points that you have raised, how critically important it is to connect people into social networks that are going to be meaningful for them, to help people create those social bonds that are going to create that intimate circle around them that's the foundation for their ability to integrate and to enter into the broader society. We've relied very heavily on the incredible manual on working with LGBT refugees that was provided by the Heartland Alliance. If any of you work with this population and aren't familiar with it, I really commend that resource to you. We've made it available to our whole network. It is the organization that has been designated to provide technical assistance on these issues by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're just tremendously committed and tremendously knowledgeable on these issues. We also work closely with several colleague organizations whose primary mission is working with the LGBT community. So I'm sorry that you have not found the kind of support that you had hoped from our organization. I can tell you that the commitment is there and the intention is there, and if you can raise particular issues that you think that we could do better on, I would really welcome that input and that feedback. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
And I think we have a question here. Maybe we are now at 12 o'clock, so we'll take this one. If people, I don't know how our panelists are for time, but we could maybe take one or two more. And I'm sure if you're staying, the conversation can continue over lunch if you have specific questions for people. So we'll take this one.
Okay, I have one for integration and reintegration, if that's okay. My name is Hansel Nutt. I'm a case manager at You for Tomorrow. And I just want to see the integration part, if you could talk about for care providers, it's not really, there's a focus of the reintegration while the UACs are in the care. So it's really about getting them reunified with their sponsors as quickly as possible. But is there some comments that you want to say about that initial integration and more particularly for care providers that provide multiple services for other members in the community? They don't allow the UACs to mix with the native members of the community. So do you think that separation is helpful in part of this overall integration process, or should the UACs have more, I guess, contact with the natives of the communities? And for the reintegration question, I just wanted to find out more about what your experience has been in the context of reception. When I've done some research about Honduran deportees, particularly adults, there was this sentiment that they're deported for a reason and from community members, so they were stigmatized, and it was hard for them to reintegrate because of the stigmatization. So it was double stigmatization by their experience in the U.S. and then when they return back home.
I just have a clarification question. When you say the UACs aren't able to be with the native population, how do you mean that? I guess I'm not familiar.
Sure. So at You for Tomorrow specifically, we have a program that's designated for at-risk youth, and they're not UACs. They're the natives in the community, not the foreign-born. And the services we provide for them are the education services and other services that are separate from the services that we provide for the UACs.
I wonder if any of that has to do with funding. I'm not familiar with how your program works, but the first thing that pops to my mind is funding. I don't know any other reason to keep them separated. And one point about when you were saying reintegrate with families or their sponsors, I want to point out that sometimes that's integrate with their sponsors. They sometimes don't know the people that they're, even though they may be family members or something, they or even parents, they may not really know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant integrate.
Sometimes it's reintegrate and sometimes.
Well, first of all, integration is a long-term process. So a lot of what we do as service providers is actually not integration. It's those initial services of reception or of reunification. And it doesn't address, what ends up being a multi-year process. There are some things that you can do. I mean, what you're really trying to do is create, on the one hand, independence, the knowledge, the skills, the ability to navigate the community, the education, the ability to sustain oneself economically. And on the other hand, you're trying to help people toward interdependence, to be part of a world and a community and a social circle. And so I would just say to that, I also don't know the circumstances that would keep UACs apart from other children, but anything that can be done to bring people together, that one-to-one connection where people get to know each other and each other's stories and are invested in each other, is healthy for integration for both sides of the integration process. And but to the extent that in any program addressed toward migrants, that there can be opportunities for that kind of one-to-one contact, it's going to be a stronger, healthier, more successful program in the long run.
And then, I mean, regarding your question around the stigma of returned migrants once people return back to their communities, absolutely, we've seen in conversations with folks returned to Guatemala, but also people who work with returned migrants in Honduras and El Salvador. There's very much this, I mean, in addition to the massive debt and the family tensions, there's very much a stigma of, well, you failed, or you were deported for some reason, maybe you're a criminal now. And then specifically, we see girls looking at the stigma of, oh, well, you migrated, you must have slept with a coyote, or you've been raped, or whatever, and now you're damaged goods, you're unclean. I mean, all the things, and it really goes very, very deeply. So these are definitely some of the reasons that some of the youth, especially the older youth that we work with, decide they really cannot go back to their community of origin and decide they've got an aunt who lives somewhere else and they're going to try to start over there because the stigma of whatever has happened or is perceived to have happened on the journey is really so damaging.
If I may, just
Yeah.
one quick comment regarding your last question about the stigma part. And I think another interesting thing is that by at least in our experience, is that by having these new reception centers being open, the citizens have a better chance of preparing themselves in order to go back home in a more decent humanitarian way, because now they're not seen as I think you saw the experience, because Hansel reminded me that we met a couple of years ago in the reception center, and you've seen how they traditionally were being sent back. Now this process allows them at least to have this new option of being more dignified way of being receptive at home. And once they leave these reception centers, they have a better, a chance to look different once they get back to their communities. Not just like they would drop off the bus and just immediately try to see or find their way back home.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you as well for your interest and for being here today. So, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Please don't leave yet. Give us a couple of seconds. We have questions for our panelists and our moderator. Thank you very much. I don't know you, but I think I've learned a lot today. My brain is like, thank you very much for all your work and the support that you are giving to our immigrant communities. Thank you very much. We have lunch now. On page 13 of your guide, there is the instructions for Wi-Fi. Please join the conversation on migration matters, and there is other hashtag.
Protect humanity.
Protect humanity. So make sure that you take pictures and just share any posts of today on social media. Thank you very much. So we have lunch right now.
Bon appetit.
And I would just say, I have materials out